Have you ever wondered what Jesus really looked like? The image we've all come to know, pale skin, long hair, and a gentle gaze, might not be the whole story. What if I told you that Pontius Pilate, the very man who oversaw Jesus' trial and crucifixion, left behind a letter with astonishing details about Jesus' physical appearance, details that aren't even mentioned in the Gospels? In this video, you're about to discover the shocking truth hidden within this ancient letter, an account so rare that it has left historians, theologians, and believers alike absolutely speechless. But here's where things get even more intriguing. Pilate's letter doesn't just describe Jesus' face and skin color. It recounts his miracles, his trial, and, believe it or not, his resurrection. Yes, you heard that right. Pilate, the Roman governor who sentenced Jesus to death, was so stunned by the events he witnessed that he felt compelled to write to Emperor Tiberius, documenting not just Jesus' trial, but the mysterious phenomena that followed his death. What could have shaken Pilate so deeply that he wrote about it to the most powerful man in the world at the time? What did he actually see? And, most intriguingly, what did Jesus truly look like according to this Roman's first-hand account? The letter reveals that Jesus' appearance was strikingly different from the images we've grown up with. It's a description so detailed and unusual that it could completely change the way we perceive the historical Jesus. Could it be that our modern depictions of Jesus have been wrong all along? Did Jesus have the features of someone we would never expect? And how does Pilate's account fit into the larger mystery of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? Stay tuned as we explore the powerful and surprising details of this ancient Roman letter. Together, we'll uncover new insights into Jesus' physical presence and the supernatural events that surrounded him. Events that may have been more extraordinary than we ever imagined. By the end of this video, you'll have a new understanding of who Jesus was, both as a man and as a figure who transcended the ordinary. Prepare to be astonished by the revelations that Pilate himself witnessed. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, is remembered primarily as the man who authorized Jesus' crucifixion. However, Pilate's role in history is much more complex than that of a mere bureaucrat following orders. In fact, Pilate's personal reflections on Jesus are shockingly different from the cold, calculating image we often associate with him. In this letter to Emperor Tiberius, Pilate shares an intimate account of his interactions with Jesus, painting a picture of a man who was not only respected, but also feared by many in power. The letter begins with Pilate explaining that he had no initial interest in Jesus when he first arrived in Judea. To Pilate, Jesus was simply another religious figure causing unrest among the Jewish population. However, as Pilate began to hear more about Jesus' teachings and miraculous deeds, his curiosity grew. This wasn't the first time Pilate had encountered a figure claiming to be a prophet, but unlike others who had been easily dismissed as troublemakers, Jesus stood out. Pilate describes how rumors about Jesus' ability to heal the sick, raise the dead, and calm storms spread throughout the province. The local Jewish leaders were increasingly concerned, not just about the political ramifications of Jesus' growing following, but about the threat he posed to their own authority. These religious leaders frequently reported Jesus to Pilate, accusing him of blasphemy and insurrection. However, Pilate was not easily convinced. In his letter, Pilate emphasizes that Jesus didn't appear to be a typical rebel or agitator. In fact, Pilate goes so far as to suggest that Jesus seemed more sympathetic to Roman rule than to the Jewish authorities. Pilate observed that while many Jewish leaders were eager to incite rebellion against Rome, Jesus' message was far more peaceful. Pilate even recounts one instance where Jesus famously said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," which resonated deeply with the Roman governor. Despite the mounting pressure from Jewish leaders to arrest Jesus, Pilate was hesitant. He viewed Jesus not as a threat, but as a man of remarkable wisdom. Pilate's respect for Jesus grew, particularly after hearing reports of Jesus' calm and authoritative demeanor during public teachings. This was not the behavior of a man looking to incite rebellion, and Pilate began to see Jesus in a different light. The relationship between Pilate and the Jewish high priests, however, was much more contentious. In his letter, Pilate refers to the high priest and other Jewish leaders as deceitful and power-hungry. He notes that they came to him repeatedly with complaints about Jesus, accusing him of undermining their authority and threatening to destabilize the region. Pilate, however, was not easily swayed by their arguments. He saw through their attempts to manipulate Roman authority to eliminate a man they feared for his growing influence among the common people. One of the most fascinating elements of Pilate's letter is his admission of the extraordinary nature of the events surrounding Jesus' life. Pilate, a man steeped in Roman logic and law, found himself wrestling with the possibility that something far greater was happening. He recounts how he tried to maintain order in Jerusalem while allowing Jesus to preach freely. This freedom that Pilate granted Jesus infuriated the Jewish authorities, who were determined to see Jesus silenced. As Pilate's letter continues, he describes how he avoided direct confrontations with Jesus, instead relying on reports from his trusted secretary Manlius. Manlius, who spoke Hebrew fluently and had the ear of the governor, often mingled with the crowds that gathered to hear Jesus speak. What he reported back to Pilate were not the ravings of a revolutionary, but the profound wisdom of a teacher who spoke with a depth that few had ever witnessed. Pilate was particularly struck by the calm and gentle nature of Jesus, even when he was faced with the hostility of the religious leaders. One of the central themes of Pilate's letter is his growing unease with the situation in Judea. Pilate had always seen Jerusalem as a difficult province to govern. Its people were prone to rebellion, and the religious tensions were constant. But the presence of Jesus added a new layer of complexity. Pilate felt torn between his duty to maintain order and his personal belief that Jesus had done nothing to warrant the severe punishment that was being demanded by the Jewish authorities. In his letter, Pilate openly admits that his life as governor had been filled with troubles, and that he often feared the priests and their influence over the people. He describes how the city of Jerusalem seemed to be on the verge of revolt at any moment, and the pressure to appease the Jewish leaders was immense. Despite this, Pilate was reluctant to act against Jesus because, in his eyes, Jesus posed no real threat to Rome. Pilate's reflections also reveal his deep fear of what might happen if he allowed the situation to escalate. He was aware that Judea was a powder keg, and any misstep could lead to a full-scale rebellion. However, Pilate's respect for Roman justice and his growing belief that Jesus was a righteous man held him back from taking immediate action. As the letter progresses, Pilate foreshadows the events that would eventually lead to Jesus' trial and crucifixion. He speaks of his internal conflict and the pressure mounting from all sides, pressure from the Jewish leaders, from the Roman Senate, and even from his own fears of losing control over the province. By the end of this section of the letter, Pilate sets the stage for the fateful decision he would soon be forced to make. It's clear that, at this point, Pilate is not just concerned about maintaining political stability. He is beginning to question the very nature of the man standing before him and the extraordinary events unfolding in Judea. As Pilate continued his letter to Emperor Tiberius, one of the most intriguing aspects he focused on was the miraculous deeds and profound teachings of Jesus. Pilate, a man of Roman law and governance, was not one to be easily impressed by tales of the supernatural. Yet, as reports of Jesus' works began to reach him, he couldn't ignore the extraordinary nature of the events unfolding in his province. Pilate describes how Jesus gained a massive following, not just because of his teachings, but also due to the astonishing miracles attributed to him. These miracles weren't isolated incidents whispered about in secret. They were public, witnessed by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. The stories that reached Pilate's ears were impossible to dismiss as mere rumors. From healing the sick to feeding large crowds with a few loaves of bread and fish, Jesus' actions had become the talk of the region. But perhaps the most significant miracle that caught Pilate's attention was the resurrection of Lazarus. This event was so striking that even Pilate, who typically relied on reports from his subordinates, sought out first-hand accounts. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, yet, according to numerous witnesses, Jesus had called him out of his tomb, alive and well. Pilate mentions that he was particularly intrigued by this event because it was so well documented and undeniable, even to the most skeptical of observers. It was no longer possible for Pilate to view Jesus as just another prophet or teacher. Something far more significant was at work. Pilate goes on to explain how Jesus' teachings further distinguished him from the other religious figures of the time. Unlike the Zealots who sought to incite rebellion against Roman rule, Jesus' message was one of peace, love, and forgiveness. Pilate recounts that Jesus often spoke of a kingdom not of this world, a statement that both intrigued and baffled the Roman governor. This was not the language of someone seeking political power. Instead, Jesus seemed to be more concerned with the spiritual well-being of his followers, emphasizing humility, compassion, and charity over material wealth or status. What stood out most to Pilate was the wisdom embedded in Jesus' teachings. He recounts one particular instance where Jesus was asked whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar, a loaded question designed to trap him into making a politically dangerous statement. Jesus' response, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," left Pilate in awe. It was a clever, almost philosophical answer that skillfully navigated the tension between religious obligation and Roman law. Pilate realized that this was not the rhetoric of a revolutionary, but of a man who had a profound understanding of both human and divine law. Pilate also mentions that Jesus' approach to the Jewish leaders of the time was bold and often confrontational. While Jesus preached peace and compassion, he did not shy away from criticizing the hypocrisy of the religious elite. Pilate observed how this boldness earned Jesus powerful enemies among the Pharisees, Sadducees, and other influential Jewish groups. In his letter, Pilate describes Jesus as having a unique ability to see through people's pretensions, often calling out the religious leaders for their self-righteousness and their manipulation of the law for personal gain. This, more than anything, seemed to be what fueled their desire to see Jesus silenced. But while the Jewish leaders grew increasingly hostile toward Jesus, Pilate found himself more and more fascinated by him. Pilate recounts how he would receive almost daily complaints from the high priests and other officials, urging him to arrest Jesus. Yet, Pilate resisted. He saw in Jesus a man who was not seeking to overthrow Roman rule or incite rebellion, but someone whose focus was on a much higher calling. Pilate writes that the more he learned about Jesus, the more he became convinced that this was no ordinary man. Despite this, Pilate acknowledges that Jesus' popularity was causing unrest in the region. The crowds that followed him were growing larger, and there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. The Jewish leaders feared that if Jesus continued to gain influence, it would destabilize their already tenuous control over the people. And while Jesus never directly challenged Roman authority, Pilate knew that any unrest in Jerusalem could quickly spiral out of control. He was caught between two forces: the religious leaders who wanted Jesus gone, and his own growing belief that Jesus was innocent of any crime deserving of death. As Pilate wrestled with this dilemma, he continued to receive reports of Jesus' miracles. These weren't just simple acts of healing or charity, they were signs of something far greater. Pilate mentions how Jesus had the ability to calm storms, walk on water, and even command the elements. These reports, while unbelievable to a man like Pilate, were consistent and came from multiple, credible sources. Pilate found himself questioning the very nature of the world around him. Could it be that this man from Nazareth truly had divine power? Or was there some other explanation for the extraordinary events taking place in his province? By this point in the letter, it's clear that Pilate is deeply conflicted. On one hand, he is a Roman governor, tasked with maintaining order and enforcing the law. On the other, he is witnessing events that defy explanation and challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. Pilate admits that he was beginning to wonder if Jesus might actually be the Messiah that the Jews had long awaited. This was not an idea that Pilate took lightly. He knew that if Jesus truly was the Messiah, his actions and decisions would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Judea, but for the Roman Empire as a whole. In this section of the letter, Pilate's tone shifts from that of a detached observer to someone who is personally invested in the outcome of the events unfolding before him. He is no longer simply a governor trying to maintain peace in a difficult province. He is a man grappling with the possibility that he is witnessing something far greater than a political or religious conflict. Pilate's growing respect for Jesus is palpable, and it's clear that he is beginning to question whether his role in this drama is more than just that of a Roman official enforcing the law. As this section draws to a close, Pilate hints at the difficult decisions he will soon have to make. He knows that the Jewish leaders will not stop until they see Jesus dead, but he also knows that there is something special about this man, something that makes Pilate hesitate to condemn him to the fate they so eagerly demand. As we delve further into Pilate's letter to Emperor Tiberius, one of the most striking portions comes when Pilate describes Jesus' physical appearance. This part of the letter is especially remarkable because it provides details that differ significantly from the traditional depictions of Jesus we've become accustomed to today. Pilate, as an eyewitness to these events, offers a rare and unique perspective on what Jesus actually looked like. In his letter, Pilate begins by explaining that Jesus did not look like the other people of the region. In fact, his appearance was distinct, immediately setting him apart from the crowds. According to Pilate, Jesus was of average height, but there was something about his presence that commanded attention. He moved with a calm dignity, and his demeanor was always serene, even in the face of the extreme hostility directed toward him by the religious leaders. One of the most surprising details in Pilate's description is Jesus' hair. Pilate writes that Jesus' hair was light brown, almost golden, and it fell softly over his shoulders. This description is a stark contrast to the darker, more Mediterranean features often associated with the people of that time and region. Pilate notes that Jesus' hair had a slight wave to it, which added to his distinct and somewhat otherworldly appearance. This detail alone has fascinated scholars and believers alike, as it challenges the traditional depictions of Jesus with darker, more Middle Eastern features. But it's not just Jesus' hair that Pilate describes in such detail. His eyes, Pilate writes, were one of his most remarkable features. According to Pilate, Jesus' eyes were deep and piercing, with a color that seemed to change depending on the light or who was observing him. Some described his eyes as light brown, while others swore they saw hints of blue. Pilate himself admits that it was difficult to pin down exactly what color they were, but what he does emphasize is the effect those eyes had on people. Pilate describes how, when Jesus looked at someone, it was as if he could see into their very soul. His gaze conveyed both deep compassion and an unshakable firmness, a combination that left a lasting impression on everyone who encountered him. Pilate goes on to describe Jesus' skin, another feature that stood out from the typical appearances of those around him. Jesus' skin, Pilate writes, was fair and smooth, with a texture that indicated he spent time outdoors but was still well kept. This description of Jesus with fair skin is again at odds with many of the common depictions of him. Pilate's account suggests that Jesus had a healthier, well-maintained appearance, not someone who had been worn down by the harsh desert conditions. This detail gives the impression that Jesus, despite his humble lifestyle, took care of his body in a way that was noticeable even to someone like Pilate. In addition to these physical traits, Pilate highlights the overall impression that Jesus made on those around him. He wasn't just a man of striking features. His entire presence radiated authority and peace. Pilate writes that when Jesus entered a room or a public space, it was impossible not to notice him. There was a certain magnetism about him, something that drew people in without him having to say a word. Pilate even goes so far as to say that artists of his time, who were skilled at depicting gods and heroes, could not have imagined the type of presence that Jesus commanded. It was something beyond the human realm, as if Jesus' very being was infused with a divine energy that set him apart from any other figure of the time. Pilate also recounts how Jesus' expression was always one of kindness and peace, even when faced with extreme adversity. Whether he was being questioned by the religious leaders or facing the angry crowds, Jesus never showed fear or anger. Instead, his face remained calm, and his eyes continued to convey that deep, compassionate understanding of the world around him. This ability to remain composed in the face of overwhelming pressure is something that Pilate found both impressive and unsettling. It was as if Jesus already knew what was going to happen and had accepted his fate long before the events of the crucifixion began to unfold. Pilate goes on to describe Jesus' beard, which was another feature that set him apart. According to Pilate, Jesus wore a full, well-groomed beard that added a sense of maturity and authority to his appearance. In the cultures of the time, a beard was often seen as a symbol of wisdom and dignity, and Jesus' beard only served to enhance the sense of respect that people felt when they were in his presence. Pilate notes that Jesus' beard, like his hair, was well maintained, further contributing to the overall impression that Jesus was a man of great inner strength and composure. When it came to his clothing, Pilate describes Jesus as dressing simply but always with dignity. His robes were modest, made from simple fabrics, but they were always clean and well kept. This reflected Jesus' detachment from material wealth and his focus on more spiritual matters. While many of the Jewish leaders of the time dressed in ornate robes to display their status and power, Jesus' simple clothing was a statement in itself. It was clear that he was not concerned with the trappings of earthly power, but was instead focused on something much greater. Pilate's letter offers a rare glimpse into the physical appearance of one of history's most famous figures. While much of what we know about Jesus has been shaped by religious art and tradition, Pilate's first-hand account challenges some of these long-held assumptions. His description of Jesus with fair skin, light brown hair, and striking eyes offers a different perspective, one that invites us to reconsider how we visualize Jesus in both historical and spiritual contexts. But beyond the physical description, what is most compelling about Pilate's account is the sense of awe and respect that he clearly had for Jesus. Pilate, a Roman governor who had likely seen countless leaders, philosophers, and religious figures throughout his life, was deeply affected by Jesus' presence. His letter to Tiberius reveals that Jesus was not just a man of striking appearance. He was someone whose very being seemed to transcend the ordinary, leaving an indelible mark on all who met him. In the final sections of Pilate's letter to Emperor Tiberius, he describes the events that led to Jesus' crucifixion and the extraordinary aftermath that followed. Pilate's reflections reveal a deep sense of inner conflict as he grappled with the weight of the decision he would soon be forced to make. Pilate explains that the pressure from the Jewish religious leaders was relentless. They had made it clear that they would not be satisfied until Jesus was sentenced to death. Despite his reservations, Pilate knew that he was walking a fine line. If he didn't appease the Jewish leaders, there was a risk of uprising, and any unrest in Judea could have severe consequences for Pilate's position and the Roman Empire's control over the region. When Jesus was brought before Pilate, the crowds were already whipped into a frenzy. They demanded his execution, shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But Pilate, seeing no fault in Jesus, tried to find a way to avoid sentencing him to death. He recounts how he questioned Jesus personally, hoping to find some justification for the charges brought against him. Yet, in his conversations with Jesus, Pilate found no cause for death. Instead, he was met with calmness and an otherworldly sense of peace from Jesus, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. One of the most famous scenes from the Gospels is when Pilate, in a symbolic act, washes his hands in front of the crowd, declaring that he is innocent of Jesus' blood. In his letter, Pilate provides more insight into this moment. He describes it not as an attempt to absolve himself of responsibility, but as an expression of his frustration and helplessness. He knew that justice was not being served, but he felt powerless to stop the events from unfolding as they did. The crowd was too large, the political stakes too high, and the religious leaders too determined. Even though Pilate had the authority to stop the execution, the weight of the situation pressed him into a corner. In his letter, Pilate also details the moments leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. After trying to release Jesus by offering the crowd a choice between freeing him or a known criminal, Barabbas, Pilate was stunned when the crowd chose Barabbas. The rejection of Jesus in favor of a violent insurgent left Pilate even more conflicted. He recounts how, after this decision, the soldiers began to mock and beat Jesus. They placed a crown of thorns on his head and wrapped him in a purple robe, sarcastically hailing him as King of the Jews. Pilate watched this unfold with growing unease, sensing that something far more significant than a simple execution was taking place. The crucifixion itself is recounted in vivid detail. Pilate, who had likely presided over many executions in his career, was deeply affected by the calm and dignified way in which Jesus faced his death. Unlike other prisoners who would plead for their lives or curse their executioners, Jesus remained silent. Pilate writes that Jesus' silence during these final hours was one of the most striking things he had ever witnessed. Even as he was nailed to the cross, Jesus did not cry out in anger or fear, but instead forgave those who were carrying out the execution, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Pilate also recalls the strange and unsettling phenomena that accompanied Jesus' death. He writes of a darkness that fell over the land in the middle of the day, an event that left the crowd terrified. Pilate mentions that this darkness felt unnatural, like a signal from the heavens. He also describes the earthquake that followed, shaking the very foundations of the city. The timing of these events was too coincidental to be dismissed as a mere natural occurrence, and Pilate admits that he was shaken by the idea that they were witnessing divine intervention. In the letter, Pilate reflects on the centurion's declaration at the foot of the cross. Truly, this was the Son of God. Pilate confesses that this statement echoed in his mind long after the crucifixion had ended. The centurion, a hardened Roman soldier who had likely seen many deaths, was moved to make such a declaration. For Pilate, this moment was a turning point. He had gone from viewing Jesus as a curious and intriguing figure to wondering if he had truly encountered a divine being. But the most astonishing part of Pilate's letter comes in his account of the resurrection. Pilate writes that only a few days after the crucifixion, reports began to circulate that Jesus' tomb was empty. His body had disappeared, and his followers were claiming that he had risen from the dead. Pilate admits that these reports deeply troubled him. While he had heard of Jesus' many miracles, the idea of someone rising from the dead was beyond anything he could have imagined. He immediately ordered an investigation into the matter, questioning the Roman guards who had been stationed at the tomb. The guards, who had been placed there to ensure that no one would steal the body, reported that they had seen a brilliant light early in the morning, unlike anything they had ever encountered. The ground shook, and they were so terrified that they fell to the ground, unable to move. When they recovered, the tomb was empty, and the stone that had sealed it shut had been rolled away. Pilate was at a loss. He knew that if the resurrection was true, it would have profound implications, not just for Judea, but for the entire Roman Empire. Pilate's letter ends with a somber reflection on the events that transpired. He writes that, although he was a man of law and order, accustomed to dealing with matters of state and governance, the events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection had shaken him to his core. He acknowledges that the religious leaders had gotten what they wanted, but he also admits that he could not shake the feeling that he had played a part in something far greater than a simple trial and execution. Pilate closes his letter by confessing that he is left with more questions than answers. He wonders whether Jesus was truly the Son of God, and if so, what that means for the future of the world. His final words to Emperor Tiberius reveal a man haunted by the decisions he made, unsure of what the future holds, but certain that the events surrounding Jesus were unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. As we come to the end of Pilate's letter, it's clear that the events surrounding Jesus' life, death, and resurrection left a profound impact, not just on the people of Judea, but on Pilate himself. A Roman governor, trained in law and warfare, found himself grappling with something far beyond the political struggles of his time. Pilate's letter reveals a man who, despite his authority, felt powerless in the face of forces he couldn't fully understand. The letter, as we've explored in this video, describes a Jesus very different from the one we see in most modern depictions. According to Pilate, Jesus had striking features: light brown hair, fair skin, and piercing eyes that seemed to look deep into a person's soul. But beyond his appearance, what truly set Jesus apart was his presence, a serene, yet commanding authority that left even the most powerful men like Pilate questioning everything they thought they knew. Pilate's account of the miracles he witnessed, from Jesus raising the dead to calming storms, defies the logic and reason of the Roman world. It wasn't just the acts themselves that shocked Pilate, but the way Jesus performed them, with calm confidence, as if he knew he was fulfilling a divine plan. Pilate's reflections on the trial and crucifixion reveal a man who was reluctant to pass judgment on someone he increasingly believed was innocent. But despite his hesitation, the pressure from religious leaders and the roaring crowds forced his hand, leading to one of the most famous executions in history. What's perhaps most fascinating about Pilate's letter is his account of the resurrection. The empty tomb, the supernatural light, and the terrified Roman guards, all of these details suggest that something truly extraordinary happened. Pilate, a man of facts and law, couldn't dismiss what his own soldiers had witnessed. In his letter, Pilate leaves us with the haunting question: was Jesus really the Son of God? He admits that, even as a Roman official, he couldn't fully explain the events he had witnessed. What we can take away from Pilate's letter is more than just a historical account. It's a window into a moment where history and faith collided, leaving a lasting mark on one of the most powerful empires in the world. Pilate's letter forces us to consider the possibility that Jesus was not only a teacher or prophet, but someone whose presence on earth was far more significant than anyone at the time could have imagined. In closing, Pilate's letter invites us to see Jesus through the eyes of someone who didn't follow him as a disciple, but as a political figure caught in the middle of extraordinary events. For Pilate, Jesus was a man who defied expectations, both in his physical appearance and in his profound, unshakable connection to something greater. This letter gives us a glimpse of the Jesus that Pilate saw, someone who inspired awe, fear, and ultimately belief in something far beyond the material world. Whether you believe the accounts or see them as a piece of historical intrigue, one thing is certain. Jesus, as described by Pilate, was a figure who left a permanent mark on history and on those who came into contact with him. If this exploration of Pilate's letter has sparked your curiosity, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There's much more to uncover about the mysteries of Jesus, ancient history, and the powerful stories that shaped our world. Click on the video on your screen now to continue this journey into the past and discover more about the profound impact Jesus had on the Roman Empire and the world beyond.